Okay, so I'm going to tell you today a story about these two men on the screen. The man on the left is Michael Cox, and he was a plainclothes police officer in the Boston Police Department in January 1995, and he was at work late at night. It was actually about 2 in the morning. It was cold, and a call came on the police radio that said there'd been a shooting at a hamburger restaurant in Boston, downtown Boston, and 4 suspects fled the scene driving a stolen gold Lexus. And Cox and his partner joined in the chase. The police radio erroneously reported that an officer had been shot. And so not only Cox and his partner, but about 15 other police cars eventually joined in the chase, a high-speed chase through the streets of Boston, if you can imagine that. And about 15 minutes after driving around Boston at high speed, the suspects pulled into a cul-de-sac and they jumped out of their car and they fled in different directions. Cox was in the first car on the scene, and he got out of his car and followed one of the suspects to a fence, chain link fence, and the suspect climbed over the fence. And Cox prepared to scale the fence to give chase. And just as he was doing that, he was struck from behind on the head by a heavy object, probably a baton or the butt of a gun. And he fell down, and he was beaten brutally by 3 other men. These 3 other men turned out to be other police officers who had mistaken Cox for one of the suspects. The suspects were all black, and Cox was black, and Cox was in plain clothes that night, and it was dark. So it's actually understandable that they might have made that mistake if they didn't know who he was. The guy on the right is named Kenny Conley. He was also a police officer that night. He got the same call. He arrived about maybe 5th or 6th on the scene. And as he got out of his car, he could see that first suspect having gone over the fence and running away. And he decided to pursue him. So he ran to the fence, scaled the fence, climbed over, and chased the suspect for about a mile on foot, eventually apprehending him at gunpoint and bringing him back to the cul-de-sac to be arrested. All the suspects were eventually caught, and that case was disposed of. But the Boston Police Department had great difficulty figuring out what had happened to Cox, because no one came forward and admitted that they had accidentally beaten Cox up. Instead, they filed false police reports claiming that he sustained injuries by slipping on the ice and hitting his head on the car, on a squad car, and so on. Reports that were really inconsistent with what actually happened to him. The investigators eventually determined that Conley was in a good position to have seen what happened to Cox, because he, after all, had wound up chasing the same suspect that Cox had been chasing when Cox got on the scene. And Conley, in fact, put himself there, and he said, yes, he had run right to the fence and climbed right over, and the investigators surmised that he had run right past this beating. And they said, did you see Officer Cox there? And Conley said no, and this was done under oath in a deposition. He said, did you see anyone beating up Officer Cox? No. They asked him many different ways, and he consistently said no, he didn't see anything. All he saw was the guy he was chasing. This phenomenon, which was discovered actually in the 1970s, early in the 1970s, and then studied in the 1990s again by pioneering researchers like Ulrich Neisser and Arian Mack and Irvin Rock, is called inattentional blindness. So the idea is that when you're paying attention to one thing, you can be almost blind to other things that are not the focus of your attention, even if they happen right in front of your eyes. So this is not like little dots flashing for fractions of a second in the corner of the screen. This is a salient event that lasted for many seconds. It involved a lot of motion and even a campy attempt to get your attention by the gorilla pounding its chest. Also, the curtain changing was the entire screen, and the black player leaving was one person leaving the action, and yet many of you did not notice any of those 3 things. Some researchers have studied this with an eye tracker, which measures where you're paying attention on the screen, and found that people who don't notice the gorilla still look at it for an average of 1 full second. So looking at something does not guarantee seeing it. It's not just that your eyes were elsewhere. Looking at things doesn't guarantee seeing them if you're not also paying attention. Now, this is not just a phenomenon found among American audiences or college students. When our book came out in Korea, the publisher arranged to try this at a basketball game in Korea. And as you can see, aside from those 2 people there who are busy using their cell phones, the rest of the audience is paying attention to our video. And it turns out about half of them did not notice the gorilla, just as we find with American college students and audiences like you. Now, the interesting thing about this experiment, to my mind, is not so much that we miss things. That's important. But the fact that we're surprised that we miss things is even more important. It's one thing to know your limitations and to know that you're not paying attention to as much as you are. But here we have the illusion of attention because people mistakenly believe that they're paying attention to and noticing much more of their visual world than they really are. The illusion is that you think you should notice and you're surprised when you don't. The illusion is a belief about how your own mind works. Now, I use the word illusion deliberately because it's kind of like a visual illusion. Here's an example of a visual illusion. Which of the two figures looks larger than the other? You can just say. The one in the back, I heard someone say, okay, now the fact that you said the back, that's an illusion itself because they're both on the same screen right behind me here. One of them is not farther back than the other, but actually the depth is an illusion created by the perspective lines of the wall sort of converging at this one point. So anything that is back in that place in the three-dimensional world will look like it's larger in this two-dimensional picture. So that's the cue you use to figure that out. The one in the, quote, front is actually the same size as the one in the back. And you can see that by looking at these red lines that I drew connecting the corresponding points. And if I take away the image itself, you can see that those lines are perfectly parallel. The objects were, in fact, on the screen exactly the same size. Now, if I put it back, you still will see the one at the top look larger. You know intellectually that they're the same size, but you can't just defeat a visual illusion by knowing that you're looking at a visual illusion. I think the same thing is true of cognitive illusions, like this illusion of attention. Knowing that you're paying less attention than you really are probably won't stop you from at some point in the future thinking that you can drive and talk on your cell phone at the same time because it just feels like you're paying attention to everything. You don't feel your attention being drained away by the cell phone conversation. In fact, it is. Talking on a cell phone while you're driving impairs your driving about as much as driving under the influence of alcohol. We don't feel like it does because we're looking out the screen, out the windshield, we're seeing everything that's happening, we feel like we're processing it very well. Okay. Now, I want to say one thing about these cognitive illusions. It's not a matter of being ill-informed. For example, this woman here seems to be ill-informed about the relative size of elephants and the moon. Cognitive illusions are not about being smart or not being smart. They're not about being informed or uninformed. They're not about personality traits. They're not about who you are as an individual. They are a feature of the architecture of the human mind. So everyone is subject to the illusion of attention as far as we know. It's not a deficiency in your moral character or a personal weakness or anything like that. It's just something that goes along with being human. In a way, it's the trade-off for our ability to focus attention. It's a great thing to be able to focus attention. We can do a lot more stuff when we pay attention than when we don't pay attention. In fact, you couldn't even follow that basketball flying around on the screen without a pretty well-developed ability to pay attention and track things visually, and that's a very useful ability. You couldn't be a sports fan without that ability, for example, for those of you who value sports fans. Now, another factor at play here is the power of expectations. Our perception is driven a lot more than we realize by what we expect to see. Things we expect to see are easier to see. Things we don't expect to see or expect to happen are much harder than we realize to see. And here's an example from the world of sports. In case you haven't seen this, I'd like you to watch this football play and watch how it develops here. Watch what the quarterback does on the red-shirted team. Now, those of you who understand football, and you don't really need to understand too much about football to understand this, would recognize that this is a trick play. This is a trick. Now, why do we call a trick play a trick? Well, a trick play subverts our expectations. In a trick play, something happens that we really don't expect to happen. It's a legal play. It's not an illegal play, but it's something that's almost never done. So in this case, the quarterback just reaches around the center, takes the ball, walks through the line, and starts running. Nobody expects a football play to start that way. The guy's already through the line and on his way to the end zone before it's realized. It's the power of expectations. You're not expecting that to happen. You're not expecting to see that. You don't even realize what's going on until it's too late. Now, from the world of forensic anthropology, you may have heard the story. This is not, by the way, an alien recovered from a crash site. This is an actual human being who had fallen into a crevasse in the Alps thousands of years ago, and his body was preserved in ice till it was discovered later. And this is his actual body of a man who's many thousands of years old. There was a great mystery as to how he died. How did he die and be preserved in this way? And for years, it was believed that he must have sort of slipped and fell or something like that, or made a mistake. And he was examined many times, and many x-rays were taken. Only many years later was it realized that the circled object on this x-ray is an arrowhead, and that he died of some kind of murder or aggression or violence. And that changed the whole story that anthropologists and others believe about what the life of very early man involved and how much violence was involved in it and how people lived and died at that time. All because they looked at these x-rays over and over again, not expecting to see an arrowhead there, and then finally they noticed that it was one. This happens all the time in radiology, by the way. Now let's get back to the case of Kenny Conley for a second. We found out about that case, and we thought maybe, well, inattentional blindness is what's going on here. Maybe Conley really was paying attention to that guy he was chasing, and it was legitimate that he didn't notice the fight going on. Nobody in the case really thought about that. Nobody mentioned this. The research was just getting started at the time anyhow. They didn't really know about it. But I wanted to test this at Union College and see whether it's possible to miss something much more salient than a campy gorilla in a short video. So we actually used the campus of Union College, and we had our subjects in our experiment jog a path along the red line in this diagram from the start point to the end point. It takes about 3 minutes to jog that path. And they followed another student who was working with us. And the student who was working with us would touch his head during the run, and the subjects who were following him about 30 feet behind were told to just silently count in their head the number of times the runner touched his own head. This is to sort of simulate what Conley was probably doing, like watching for the suspect to pull a gun out or throw away drugs or do something that he would want to take note of and pay attention to, or just to track the guy at night. Now, what we didn't tell our subjects was that partway along the route, we staged a fight outside one of the frat houses. And there's a picture of what it looked like. We had two guys pretend to beat up another guy. The picture shows it in daylight, but we ran the experiment first at night when it was completely dark. And sure enough, when we asked our subjects at the end of the run how many head touches they counted, they got that right. But when we asked them whether they had seen three guys fighting along the route, only 1/3 of the subjects in our experiment reported seeing the fight. And the fight was visible for quite a ways away. Even during the day, when we ran the same experiment again in broad daylight, about 40% of people still missed the fight in broad daylight. So that leads me to believe that it's possible that Conley was actually telling the truth, that he really didn't see what he claimed not to have seen, and that inattentional blindness was what was going on. There's no proving that, because we're not inside Conley's head. It's possible that he was lying all along, but I think that's pretty unlikely, and I think inattentional blindness can happen in these situations. Now, I just want to take a couple more minutes at the end here to talk about one more illusion, which is very related to that, and that's the illusion of memory. The illusion of memory is in the news these days. It's in the news all the time when politicians are involved. And the illusion of memory is the misbelief that our memories are more perfect and accurate and objective and permanent than they really are. Now, of course, we all know we don't remember what we had for breakfast, 72 days ago or something like that. That's not the kind of memory we're talking about. We're talking about important things. We expect people to remember important things, and when they forget them, we think they must not think they're important, or maybe they're mentally ill or something like that. For example, in the 2008 campaign, Hillary Clinton was almost a Democratic nominee. One reason she wasn't was that she misremembered having been shot at in Bosnia on a visit to Bosnia as First Lady. She remembered sniper fire and running and covering and a greeting ceremony canceled and all this kind of stuff until photos surfaced of the greeting ceremony and the little girl and all the contemporaneous press accounts that said, well, she really wasn't under fire in Bosnia and so on. What's interesting to me is what the public reaction to this false memory was. It's well illustrated by the cover of the New Republic, which had a headline, "The Voices Inside Her Head," implying that, perhaps Hillary was crazy or demented or there's something wrong with her that she was recalling these false memories. Actually, I think Hillary Clinton was doing what a lot of us do all the time, which is we combine different elements of our memories into one coherent story. We just don't have the press corps following us around, whipping out the video to show that we're actually getting it wrong. Even your memories of extremely salient emotional events like 9/11 or the explosion of the space shuttle, or if you're old enough, the assassination of President Kennedy, get contaminated and changed over time just as much as ordinary memories. We just think those memories are and should be perfect. The most recent example, of course, Rick Perry forgot one of the 3 government agencies he was going to dismantle. If you read the news coverage after this, there were basically 2 threads of news coverage. One was his campaign's over because he screwed up. The other thread was, well, we interviewed a bunch of psychologists and neurologists, and they all said this is pretty normal. This happens to everyone every so often. If we didn't have this illusion of memory, we might not be so hard on people like Rick Perry. We could be hard on him for other reasons, but not for forgetting something on stage. Now, I just want to show you that it's not just things like that. You often don't even remember what you were doing 2 seconds ago. And here's an example of this. In this experiment, the guy on the left has approached the gentleman in white hair in the center on the quad of Cornell University and asked him for directions to the gym. Watch what happens as he gives directions. There's no sound on this video, but you don't have to hear what they're saying in order for it to make sense. He starts pointing to where he wants the guy to go. They have a conversation about how to get there. Partway through the conversation, they're rudely interrupted. And the two guys carrying the door through, one of them changed places with the initial person asking the questions. And the conversation just proceeds as though nothing had happened. And you'll see that the gentleman in white hair, who's very kind to let this video be displayed so many times, goes and looks right at him later on, and at the end is told, you were in a psychology experiment, do you realize that I'm not the same person you were talking to? And he said he had no idea. About 50% of people in this experiment don't realize that they're talking to a different person than they were talking to 3 seconds earlier. So a brief interruption and a change in your visual world is enough to wipe out your memory, or at least to cause you not to compare what you're seeing with what was going on before. Sorry, I skipped ahead a second. So this phenomenon is called change blindness. So we can be blind to changes that happen in our visual worlds much more than we realize. And it illustrates, once again, the limitations of memory and also attention. So I want to come back at the end of the talk to this issue of multitasking again. Here's what happens in a typical experiment that measures multitasking. People have to memorize a display. Here it's containing these 2 red objects and a bunch of blue objects. That's the second box there. And then they have to keep it in mind only for about 900 milliseconds. That's less than 1 second. That's about 9/10 of a second. And then they get another one that they have to compare to the one they memorized and say whether it's the same or different. So the first one's gone, but you've only had to keep track of it for a second or so. And then you have to say whether the next one is same or different. And you only have to pay attention to the red ones. So notice in the second display that the red ones are different than they were in the first display, because one of them's at an angle and it was horizontal in the first place. It's a fairly easy task to understand, but the times are very short, so it's actually sort of not as easy as it seems. Turns out people are pretty good at this. They can do it. And if you look at some data from people coming up, this is an experiment by Clifford Nass and colleagues, by the way. The dotted line at the top shows you what one group of subjects did. Interestingly, it didn't really matter how many blue objects there were. That's those number of distractors. The more blue objects you add, it doesn't really affect your ability to pay attention to the red objects. You just pay attention to the red objects and you remember them. The line that's going down at the bottom, though, is a different group of people. These people got worse the more blue objects they were. Now, who were these people? Well, these were people who were called high-media multitaskers. These are people like the person in the picture who habitually use their smartphone, watch TV, use their computer, and so on all at the same time. And they seem to not be able to filter out distraction as well as other people can. Now, we don't know if that's a cause that goes in the direction of I multitask all the time, therefore I've lost the ability to filter things out, or I'm not very good at filtering things out, therefore I don't mind multitasking all the time, although there's other information sources. There's a link there. There's something about multitasking and paying attention. We don't know what direction it goes in. But clearly we're not as good at multitasking as we think we are, and our environment is giving us many more opportunities to multitask, and that can be a bad thing. Finally, I just want to come back to Officers Cox and Conley at the end. Cox recovered from his injuries and returned to the police force and was promoted up the ranks, and his career went on. Conley, as I mentioned, lost his job after the Supreme Court didn't hear his appeal, but he kept on taking more appeals. He was well supported by lawyers, and eventually one of his appeals was successful. It turned out that the prosecutors had improperly withheld evidence from his defense team. Unfortunately, it didn't have to do with inattentional blindness and all that stuff. That was not the thing that cracked the case. I wish I could say that it did. It was a more routine issue of misconduct. The prosecutors decided not to prosecute the case again. Now, that may have had something to do with their realization that it might be hard to convince another jury that Conley was actually lying. Conley decided he wanted to get back on the police force, so he reapplied 10 years later, had to go through rookie training again, and got back on the police force, recouped all his back pay, and is now once again an officer in the Boston Police Force. And when our experiment came out earlier this summer that we ran on the Union campus that I showed you the picture of earlier, Conley was asked for interviews by NPR and other organizations, and he actually refused and said he just wants to go on with his career. But he did tell us that he thought our experiment supported what he's been saying all along, and that he was glad it had been done. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention. And just to sum up the message of this talk, I've told you about some limitations of your own mind and the ways that attention and memory don't work as well as we think they do. But perhaps knowing about those limitations, for example, if you were on a jury in the future in a case like Conley's or others involving eyewitness testimony or other issues where the fallibility of the human mind comes into play, maybe knowing about those things will help you make better decisions in your own lives. And you can, as we like to say, watch out for gorillas in your midst.